So first of all, this is the Shir of Friday. This is the second Igeres HaKodesh. And then the Kud of this Igeres HaKodesh speaks about the Maila of Maaseh, of Asiyah. The previous one spoke about Parchal Ha'ela and the Chilik of Parchal Ha'ela with and without Dibur. This one deals with Asiyah. And I think it's also connected to these Prakim, MarCheshvan Metes Mem. It says in Kabbalah, "She'ein achzoras panim bepanim kiyama the mitzvahs ma'asiyas dafka." Period. The Eibishter did not allow for a yichud panim bepanim until mitzvahs ma'asiyas came along. That means like this: the Eibishter created the world. Other Machave got into trouble. Yeah, Matan Torah happened 2,448 years later. The Aves didn't have mitzvahs ma'asiyas; they had mitzvahs ruchnias, kamuvan, with the exception of bris milah that the Aves had and so forth. They didn't really have mitzvahs. So that Izal says that until Matan Torah and mitzvahs ma'asiyas, the Eibishter did not allow yichud panim bepanim. Yichud panim bepanim is a zoy. In Kabbalah, everything goes in yichudim, marriages. You have a marriage, you have children. The children is hashpah, which comes to a lower world, and as a result of the hashpah, which comes to a lower world, there's a greater koyach to serve the Eibishter. So there's different madregas of yichudim. You can have acher ba'acher, you have panim ba'acher, acher ba'panim, and so forth. There's a lot of different madregas. One of the highest madregas is panim ba'panim. So there's in the yichudim that exist in the Elam Al Yenim. Now, Mr. Shalach could have made yichudim, Neach could have made yichudim, Chanech could have made yichudim, Lemech could have made yichudim, Sheis could have made yichudim, but yichud panim ba'panim waited for mitzvahs ma'asiyas. V'tam adavar. The reason for it is, Dafka, when you do mitzvahs ma'asiyas, you create the proper zivit. And the question is, why was it necessary that there should be mitzvahs ma'asiyas? What's wrong with yichudim ruchniim, based on kavanas, meditations? There were many tzaddikim before the Avis, and certainly since before Matan Torah, who were very makush talakus, who were davik, and they had shaychas teilamos. They didn't have mitzvahs, but the shaychas to get l'chai without mitzvahs ma'asiyas. Why did they make yichudim panim bepanim? And the answer is as follows: Yuvi mashikosav b'sharman umat. That in order to make a yichud panim bepanim proper, there shouldn't be a unique lachitzainim. Kitzarach tchilah requires first lihiyes halos man the nukva the zoh, to lift up the nukva of zoh. In other words, there has to first be a nisarusa dilatata. In order for the yichud momayla lamata to be mad, which is called d'churin, masculine, to be proper, there has to first be a seder some below. In other words, in order for there to be a yichud from a lakus and elamis that's proper without yikazachitainim, elamis have to initiate, and the initiation is called halas man from nukva dezah. Nukva dezah basically means malchus or shechina, which is the point he's going to say momentarily is that there has to be birurim. You have to fix the sparks of klipa that are messed up al ta'achana for the yichud, and then the yichud will be without a unique zachitainim. If you have a yichud without birurim first, then there could be a unique zachitainim. Hein bechinas asiyah uman de nukva bechinas asiyah k'mei shekatash on perek aleph. And this idea of eserusa delatata from man de nukva is asiyah, action. V'hinei, he explains, hamaisim teivim nikra kisuach v'kitzutz hakeitzim anachazim b'charai. When we do good deeds, it's called pruning, or cutting off the thorns that are holding onto the klipa shein bechinas asiyah, which is the level of asiyah. In other words, what is the reason there has to be a serusa latata first, a birurim first, for there to be a yichud pnimi, a yichud panim bepanim avava? Is because it's mevared. It fixes the sparks and it cuts off the klipas, the thorns of klipa that are stuck in the periphery. If the Eibishter makes a yichud without first there being an halas man from us, the thorns of klipa that are there are going to affect a unika to klipa. And therefore the Eibishter did not allow yichud panim bepanim until we started doing mitzvahs ma'asiyas. This means that through the good which is concealed in the klipas. And the klipas, of course, are melubish, b'mitzvahs ma'asiyas. They're connected to physical deeds because they're connected to the Gashmi world. And when we do birurim of the Gashmi world, we lift up the Gashmi of the mitzvahs ma'asiyas, the mikede, to its root, which is the kedushas Atzilus, the holiness of Atzilus. And Atzilus is shekvar huvra, that's been totally corrected and clarified and separated, and there's no confusion. And therefore, when the later is a yichud panim bepanim, there will not be a yichud zachatayim. Says the Alter Rebbe, or MarCheshvan. It says in the original Eitz Chaim, the Eitz Chaim Shara Nakudis, I think. She'adam Marishan Tikin Gamkin Aidei Tefillah. The other mission also was able to effect a correction, and he did it through davening, not through mitzvahs ma'asis. Says the Alter Rebbe, don't get confused. Hainu are the Eisis Adibur. He spoke Eisis of Tefillah, the Akimas Vasav Haba Ma'aser. The utterance of his lips is considered a deed, like we had in Tanya Perek Lamed Zayin and Perek Lamed Ches in the beginning of the Prakim. Because when you speak, it has to do with the animal soul, which is in the body, the dama, and the blood, as opposed to machshav. This is big in Perek Lamed Zayin at the beginning, in Perek Lamed Ches. Nega, which comes from nega, and therefore, since dibur involves the guf, and the shabahamis, and the blood, which comes from nega, so speech also affects a birur, and after a birur there could be a yichud pnimi without being a unique sachet. V'hinei, a birurim da asiyah, the corrections that we make in asiyah through our physical acts of mitzvahs. Eilam liyitzira ayidei sheim ban. They go up to yitzira through malchus. Umitzira lebriya ulatzilus. Meshikosav sharman d'rishudal zayin. And as a result, there could be a yichud panim upon him. So why does there have to be mitzvahs ma'asis? There could be yichudim without mitzvahs ma'asis, but panim upon him without mitzvahs ma'asis, the Eibush doesn't want a unique zachetainim. In order for there to be a yichud without a unique zachetainim, there has to first be a birur. He says still matan teira, which is where the ikir of mitzvahs ma'asim birurim started. There couldn't be a yichud panim upon him. There may have been yichudim, been very high yichudim, but panim upon him is after through matan teira. Ubazeh yuvan. This explains the Mameh Chazal, the hiruli of it midi, that you cannot accomplish anything through thought, even though you could create many yichudim through thought, but not a yichud panim bepanim. Kibaliyas halos man me'malachim shabenegel, without elevating the sparks from menachem of negel, which you can have in Sof Pashas Vayishlach, Bestach Vayamas Vayimlech. This is the goes on the Ayin Saram, the klipis of Tayu. It's impossible lahamshach tipen, to bring down points, drops, the kudus, which is like yichud atzmi, not a yichud nimi. Milmai lola zavik zun, he had a yichud between zan nukf. Kereitze linik me'imei, because midas of atzilus want a nurse from their mother, which is bina. V'lei lashpia lamata, not to be mashpia lamata, which means to malchut k'meshikosu b'shar mandrish beis. Vayim. Okay, stop. So this is the end of the first piece of this against the Kiddush. Atkan the Kudir Sheda. The next 5 lines is a different point. The Alter Rebbe says when the Bina Midas of Atzilus don't have a halos mamamata, birudim, they're nursing from their source, from Bina, they're not mashpia lamata. Yuchat panim, but panim is only after Vedas Abirudim. Now the Alter Rebbe brings a yetzim in a klal. Even though we just established a klal, that the first has to be birudim for there to be a yuchat pnimi, there's one yetzim in a klal. And this yetzim in a klal, by the way, you're going to have in the Yigeres HaKedesh tomorrow. Tomorrow we start Lahava Mashikosav Priyas Chayim. And this Yigeres HaKedesh, the first shtickle is going to say the same nukuda. And that is that when a person serves the Eibishter on a level of Mesiras Nefesh, you don't have to have mitzvahs ma'asis. The Ovis serve the Eibishter level of Mesiras Nefesh. When you're serving the Eibishter in a limited way, if you don't have birur, then there could be Nikas HaChetainim. But Mesiras Nefesh, then Mesiras Nefesh is sufficient to affect Yichud Pnimi. And he begins like this: the Isidura of a Chuli. There is a Seder which creates a Yichud. The Istakal of a Chulu, where you're looking at a lakus. In other words, you're creating a Yichud Pnimi panim b'panim without mitzvahs ma'asis. Ve'en kavanes hatfilas al-Rebbe. This is the kavanah of davening. V'yichudim al yenim, in supernal unions. L'yedim u'masigim l'Istakal of a Chulu, who no one reach to look at the essence of a lakus without mitzvahs ma'asis. And we're not afraid of Yinik Zachetzenim. Why? Kinaran shalahem. They're nefesh yocham neshama, atzma themselves. Hey man, they're doing an asnusa delatata b'mesiras nefesh ala teiro b'nefil sapayim in teiro and after shmeneser the nefil sapayim, which is higher than tefillah. In other words, if tefillah is atzilus, nefil sapayim is keser. Mesiras nefesh of teiro is also keser keneda. And when you're holding in a madrega of keser, which is higher than atzilus, even though they're not being mavadir, there's no concern about the being Yinik Zachetzenim. Naran goes on the neshama. And we're saying that there cannot be a yichud of the neshama with Allah kuz, but first being mavadir gashmis, unless the neshama is in a state of mesiras nefesh. When the neshama is in a state of mesiras nefesh, that becomes unnecessary.
It's going to keser.
Because it's going to atmos of Allah kuz, right? This is a madrega of tshuva, and the Rebbe says in some sichas, even though normally we say at the office were missing something because they were kedem matan teira, and some sichas says they were not missing the whole liyud of the sinas teira, a bit like zera in the lashon hana, because they were higher than the geder of maila and mata, of vesach al yenim and tachteinim.